Hello everyone, I'm Darcy Bono, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can paint everyone's favorite vigilante psychopaths, the Night Lords. Yes, that ragtag group of rapscallions whose hobbies include psychological warfare and full-body circumcision. So let's get started. As you can see, this is going to be a semi-metallic finish to our armor that looks really cool with the lightning pattern. So that being said, we're going to start by priming our miniature using Vallejo Silver Spray. This is my go-to metallic spray primer because it has a much finer flake and more importantly, it has a much more matte finish. What this means is that any glazes that you apply over top go on much more smoothly than other spray primers on the market that tend to have a more glossy finish that cause the glazes to kind of congeal in on themselves and run down into the recesses, and you get a lot of pooling and oversaturation in areas that you might not want it in. If you don't have access to this particular paint, you can use something like Lead Belcher, but I highly recommend dry brushing a bright silver over top of that just to provide more texture for the layers of contrast paint to stick to so they don't run off into the recesses. We're going to start our blue by making a very intense dark blue that we're going to make by mixing 2 drops of Celestium blue contrast with 1 drop Black Templar contrast. And for those familiar with the contrast range, this is going to look very similar to Leviathan blue. However, it's going to provide much more color saturation as Celestium blue is more highly pigmented. Now, this next step is very important. Before you apply your blue mixture, first apply a thin coat of Lahmian Medium. We're using Lahmian Medium instead of contrast medium because it increases both the fluidity and the transparency more than contrast medium. Both of these properties are important to us in this process, and you'll see why in just a sec. So as soon as I apply the Lahmian Medium, immediately apply your blue mixture. This is going to cause the paint to diffuse and allow you to move it around and adjust the saturation. So as you can see, I've put a lot of paint on here. So all I'm going to do is just rinse my brush and then using that damp brush, just lightly move around the areas I want to be lighter. In this case, we're actually going to be wiping away our lightning patterned area. So as soon as you've applied your blue over top the Lahmian Medium, everything is still wet, wipe a lightning bolt shaped design in the paint. I actually like doing this technique using a brush I found at Michael's. It's like $4. So it's got very tiny but stiff bristles, which are great in this case because they can basically scrape the wet paint off the surface. Sable brushes are kind of floppy and soft, and they just don't do the job quite as well as these stiffer synthetic brushes. So don't worry about being too neat with this, just make it as asymmetrical and jagged as you can. We're going to add to this in future steps. This is just setting the foundation for our lightning. So just because it is a kind of strange but very important step, let's see it again on this chest armor. Here goes a thin layer of Lahmian Medium, and then we're coming immediately back in. Do not let this dry at all. Immediately come back in with your blue contrast mixture. There it goes over top. You can see it starts to diffuse, and I'm just lightly smoothing it around until I'm satisfied. And then I immediately come in with the tiny synthetic brush and wipe a haphazard lightning pattern. Once you have done that all over your blue armor, you're now ready to enhance your lightning. In this case, I'm using Vallejo Game Air Dead White because it is a air paint. It is very fluid, which is great for making these very thin lightning lines. I recommend taking a few practice swings on another surface, as this is honestly the trickiest part of the entire process. We're going to start by adding a white line inside the silver one we made in the previous step. And then once you have your core bolt applied, you're then going to go in with more white and draw kind of a very thin helix around that. I recommend looking up pictures of lightning. As you can see, there will be a big branch with a bunch of little branches wrapped around and coming off it. So this is the hardest part for me because for some reason I keep wanting to make this really linear, like Harry Potter forehead lightning bolt, when honestly I think it looks better with the more spindly, spidery looking lightning. So that being said, don't get too frustrated with this part. It is, I will admit, kind of scary if you're not used to doing this amount of brush control. So that being said, just practice first. And if you do make a mistake, If your paint is thin, if you're using either an ink or an air paint, you can quickly wipe it away with a synthetic brush. Again, the bristles are stiff, so it'll usually bring it back up. So don't sweat it too much. We're going to be laying another layer of blue over top, so any imperfections will be significantly reduced that way as well. Now, before we get to our main blue color, we're going to be doing a simple edge highlight using Grey Knight's Steel. You can also use a bright silver for this, but keep in mind your subsequent layer of blue is going to make that very stark. So I prefer Grey Knight's Steel just because it's a little bit more subtle, but still provides a nice pop to the edges. And apologies for being grossly out of frame in this step. Fortunately, it's a pretty basic one. Just run this along the edges, focusing primarily on the sharpest edges by using the flat part of your brush. We're next going to make a very vibrant blue by mixing 2 drops of Kroxigor Scales Contrast, 1 drop of Celestium Blue, and 1 drop of Lahmian Medium to thin it down. So then all you're going to do is apply a thin coat of this over top of your blue armor. Do not soak it like we did in the first step. And you might be wondering, why are you starting on his calf? And the answer is I wasn't sure this was going to work, so I put it on the back of the miniature because I figured it would be less noticeable if I didn't like it and then had to correct it. But I do like it. I was afraid it was going to be a little bit too green, but this is perfect. So basically apply this in just a very thin coat, especially over where your lightning bolts are, because you don't want to oversaturate those and obscure what you did. So there is a quick swipe there, and then to make them more pronounced is the exact same thing we did to create them. So apply your glaze, rinse your brush, come in with a damp brush, and then lightly wipe away the center. Ta-da! You get a brighter white showing through that light blue. Now for larger, smoother parts like the pauldrons, we're going to do the exact same thing we did before and lay down a thin coat of Lahmian Medium to help this glaze diffuse evenly. So there's the Lahmian Medium. Then we're going to immediately come in with our glaze, lightly pat this around, and this will also allow you to move it off the lightning bolt as well if you oversaturate it. But all in all, that actually looks pretty great, but just lightly wipe away the center here and there just so the white shows through a bit. But you don't have to do that wipe away part on every part of the miniature. If you want more subdued lightning bolts like on his chest, just do a very thin layer. Very thin layers of this glaze also help the edges pop a bit more, as that Grey Knight Steel doesn't become as saturated and still retains a bright sheen. Now, this part is optional. It's just one extra highlight that will give your lightning quite a bit more zap. All I'm doing is taking a pinch of Kroxigor Scales Contrast and mixing that into a white. I'm using ACRYL Bold Titanium White just because it's very heavily pigmented until I get a very pale ice blue. Then, just like we did before, we're going to very lightly draw some thin lines just to add a bit of brightness to these lightning bolts. You don't need to do it over the entire thing. You basically just do little tendrils coming off the edges and then parts of the center. And you can flavor this to taste as far as how vibrant you want your lightning. Alright, we're now ready to move on to all the other metallic surfaces, but first I need to tidy them up. And to do this, I'm going to be applying some Vallejo Game Air Silver. It's very opaque and very smooth, so it's great for returning this back to its original bright silver surface. But feel free to use whatever bright silver you have handy. And if while you're making these corrections you get silver on your blue armor, don't freak out. All you have to do is immediately rinse your brush and then lightly wipe away the misplaced silver. Now it's going to leave behind a slightly glittery residue, which you can then sink back into the blue armor just by applying a very thin glaze of the Celestium Kroxigor Scales Blue. Just lightly pat it to the affected area and it will blend back in. So what we're going to do is paint all of the dark colors first, any kind of iron or steel, and then move on to the brass trim. For a dark, somewhat brown iron color, we're going to be mixing Black Legion with Lahmian Medium in an even ratio. As you can see here, I've already done his backpack balls, but for a better viewing angle, I'm going to just do it on the inside of the torso. I'm also going to be doing the joints of his arms in this as well. So this is just Black Legion and Lahmian Medium, even ratio. I'm also going to do the exact same thing on the blades, but again, I just added a layer of Lahmian Medium, and then this is just straight Black Legion. So once again, this helps the paint diffuse a little bit. I'm just doing this on the blades because I want them to be borderline black with the exception of the edges, and having that Lahmian Medium lets me move the paint around to where I want the deepest saturation. For the sake of time, we won't get too in-depth on painting weapons. This is just a very basic get some color on it approach before we move on to the nice brass trim. So all we're going to do to make our brass color is mix Garaghak Sewer and Fyreslayer Flesh in an even ratio, and we're just going to apply that over top of these bright silver surfaces. Now in this case, I broke my own rule. I should have put down a very thin layer of Lahmian Medium over these larger flat surfaces, again to help the paint diffuse because it's still fairly thick due to Garaghak Sewer being a pigmented contrast paint. So that being said, when you're working on the larger, wider trim portions, make sure to put down that layer of Lahmian Medium first so that way it diffuses and is just easier to push around. So let's try doing that the correct way. Here is the Lahmian Medium layer going on over top of this, and then immediately followed by the Garaghak Sewer Fyreslayer Flesh brass mixture. And yet again, once I've applied it, I'm wiping my brush and then just using that brush to diffuse the paint further so it's not just congealing in the recesses. One thing to note that when I apply this, while it's still wet, it has a very gold look to it. This literally looks more like an ultramarine trim, but by the time it dries, it has more of a brown tone, so it looks way more like brass than a rich gold. And speaking of brass versus gold, our edge highlight is going to help better determine what our end color is going to be. If you'd like your trim to have a much more yellow tone to it, definitely choose Liberator Gold. It'll create a kind of antique, grungy gold look. But if you prefer a slightly more brown tone to your trim, use Canoptek Alloy for your edge highlight. So since I wanted to enhance the brown tones rather than the yellows of the trim, I went ahead and opted for Canoptek Alloy, and I'm just running this along all of the sharpest edges. And actually, let me correct that. I'm running it across the sharpest edges that would be most exposed to the light. So I'm not running it over every single edge I see, I'm running it over the top edges where the light would be shining down onto it. So I usually don't bother with the bottom edges unless it's the very back shins that are way more pronounced, but I try and focus mainly on places where the light would be hitting, creating a brighter reflection. Alright, now time for the iconic Night Lord's Flayed Flesh. I base coated this in white, and now I'm just applying a straight from the pot coat of Skeleton Horde contrast all over this. One thing to note is that the more heavily you apply this, the more orange your flesh is going to look in the next step. The more sparingly you apply it, the more the pink tones are going to show through. So keep that in mind when you're applying this layer. Once the Skeleton Horde has completely dried, you're then going to apply a layer of Volpus pink contrast mixed with Lahmian Medium in an even ratio. Just one layer of this over top, and you'll see it turns very pink. Now, do the same thing we've been doing. I'm rinsing my brush, and then I'm just lightly wiping that away, and then you can see the more orange tones as the red from the pink meets with the yellow from the Skeleton Horde. Alright, we are nearly there. We just have to paint the iconic red bat wings and skull on this helmet. So this helmet's actually from the Night Lord's Praetor from the Horus Heresy, which is a slightly older Forge World sculpt, so it's not quite as crisp as the new helmets. But what I did was, after I painted the blue armor portion, I base coated everything white. I used the same white as I did for base coating the skin, Pro-Acryl Bold Titanium White. It's got really great coverage and opacity, but basically you just want to start with a bright white base coat. And then all you're gonna do is apply Flesh Terror's Red straight from the pot over top of this white. Now, don't soak your brush like I did here. I have no idea why I did this. I mean, I'm an Orcs and World Eaters fan, so sometimes I do things recklessly without thinking, I guess. So be more careful than I'm being here and don't soak your brush this much. Once the Flesh Tearer's red has completely dried, you can then go back in with an optional edge highlight using Evil Sun Scarlet. Next, we're going to paint a muted bone color using Ratling Grime and Lahmian Medium. Now in this case, it's going to be a very subtle look to the camera, and that's because we are working with something that is super transparent. This is 1 drop of Ratling Grime to 2 drops of Lahmian Medium, and Ratling Grime's not very heavily pigmented as it is, so it is very transparent right now, which is actually what we want, because we really just want this to be a kind of grungy white. So we're going to apply this first layer and make sure that it's concentrated mostly in the recesses. We're going to let it dry, and then we're going to do a quick recess shade again using the same mixture just to enhance the shadows a little bit more. So here we go, we got a bit more accurate lighting here. This is what it'll look like once it's dried, and now we're just going in with the Ratling Grime Lahmian Medium shade and then just lightly patting that in the darkest recesses. So once this portion has completely dried, you can then go back in and highlight the sharpest edges using a very light ivory like Wraithbone, but for the sake of time, let's move on to the lenses. So rather than do the traditional Space Marine lens approach, I actually want these to look scarier, so I'm going to make them look like a fiery glow. So to do that, I'm laying this flat down on my desk for greater stability, and I've painted each eye white, just like I have everything else. And then I'm going to go in with just a tiny dot of Iyanden yellow contrast. We're then going to make a very fiery red by using 2 drops Iyanden yellow contrast to 1 drop Flesh Tearer's red, and we're going to apply this predominantly in the recesses of the eye sockets. In order to do this, we're going to apply the same thing we've been doing, a layer of Lahmian Medium so the paint will diffuse into the recesses. And also, just like we've been doing, you can then use your brush to wipe away the center so the bright underlayer will show through, creating a gradient. So here is what he looks like completely finished. Now, just a few notes before we go. There were a few details on this miniature that I didn't cover on camera just for the sake of time. For example, the blood splatters on his knives and the base. I actually already have a blood tutorial, so I didn't include that, and the link for that is in the video description and will show up as a suggested video at the end of this one. There's also the lighter steel colors, such as the coils on the front, the vents on the backpack, and the skull on his breastplate. That's just Basilicanum gray contrast over the same bright silver. It just makes a dull steel color. And then finally we have his gun belt that was just Cygor brown contrast over white, makes a nice mahogany leather brown. So thanks very much for joining me today, everyone. I know this video was a long one, but we covered a lot, so I hope you learned something new. If you did enjoy it, make sure to like, subscribe, feed the algorithm. If you really enjoyed the video, you can support the channel and treat yourself by going on a shopping spree on any of the affiliate links listed in the video description. So thanks once again for joining me, and until we meet again, happy painting, everyone.